Thank you for this invitation to join Clean Water Action this evening. I remember the first day my son's pediatrician told me he was concerned about the level of lead in his blood. I was scared, confused. How would this affect my son's development? Is this why he was such an active 2-year-old? What did we do wrong? My husband and I eventually found the culprit, the windowsill on which my mom permitted him to own his art. Her windowsill was a masterpiece of scribble, scrabble, and stick figures and marker, Crayola, and stickers, and old lead paint. So we followed the doctor's instructions, remediated the danger, increased his iron intake, and the lead in his blood leveled off. A year or two later, the Inquirer broke a story about a first grader who had much higher levels of lead in his blood. The culprit in that case were the lead chips falling from the ceiling on his desk at school. I was a newly elected official, and I knew nothing about the regulations surrounding lead, the government resources available to remediate the issue. I knew nothing about the many toxins that were plaguing our schools and homes, or about the air pollution or the environment in general. I didn't know where to start. My family didn't talk about the environment or climate change, or at least not in those terms. What I did know is that this was a space where I needed to act. So I read up. I met with environmental group after environmental group. At first, many of these groups wanted to talk to me about natural gas and fracking. I understood why, and I was a fast learner. But I didn't immediately connect to those issues. There was no connection to the toxins in our city schools, no connection to the air pollution in the city of Philadelphia. It just all sounded too far and too distant. It might as well have been whales and polar bears in the North Pole. Meanwhile, the children and teachers in our schools were being poisoned every day across the city. I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about the places where my family and I and my neighbors lived, worked, and played, where we drank water, where we breathed our air. I wanted to talk about the people fighting to preserve community gardens while others illegally dumped across the street. I wanted to talk about the places where the elderly were sick or dying from heat waves because the temperature could jump just 5 degrees from one block to the next. The places that needed investments in storm water management and other environmental infrastructure. That's the environment work that I wanted to do. That's the environment work I wanted to talk about. So I met Jerome Shabazz at Cobbs Creek Environmental Center and Maurice Sampson at Clean Water Action, the first few people of color in this space that I ever saw. And we started to organize lead remediation workshops in my district. Then I met Moms Clean Air Force, and we found common ground when it came to the health of our children. So together, we all got to work. My journey in this space, in this fight for environmental justice, isn't much different from others. In fact, it isn't much different from the earlier waves of environmental justice advocates and others who helped coin the term environmental justice. It isn't different from those who fought for equitable environmental policies way before we had a term for it. And often I push back on this notion that Black and brown folks or low-income communities don't care about the environment. Of course we do. We always did. When it comes to confronting the challenges of climate change, it is those communities that are there first and longest and fighting the hardest. They come to work on those issues, but not at the expense of the very immediate environmental dangers that pose a risk to our health, their health, and their quality of life right now. We have to do both. Poor communities and communities of color don't have a choice. They are all too familiar with the impact of bad environmental policy. They often live near or adjacent to or in pollution plants, factories, incinerators. Our water sources are contaminated with chemical waste. Our children continue to be exposed by high levels of lead contamination from old pipes and paint in our homes, our schools. Our children have higher asthma rates from air pollution and other triggers. People of color, regardless of income, are 40% more likely to be exposed to air pollution than white folks. Simply put, when it comes to the air that we breathe, race matters. Poor communities and communities of color are also more likely to be impacted by and less likely to recover from climate-caused disasters. Consider the disparity in our government's response during the recovery efforts of Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Maria. In the aftermath of these weather-related disasters, these communities not only were shortchanged when it came to federal aid, they were also expected to pay more for basic necessities such as food, water, gas, and electricity. This is why communities of color and low-income communities overwhelmingly support measures to protect the environment and to address climate change specifically. Black and Latino Americans view global warming as a serious problem. We believe reduction of carbon pollution will create more and healthier jobs. We also know that the environment and pollution impact our families' health every single day. So no group has a monopoly on being an environmentalist. No group and no one's environmental cred should be judged by the donations they make or their memberships in one environmental group or another. We must all be in this together. And I mean together, including all voices. As chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, for me that means we have to address and focus on the historic and systemic inequities that have been created and perpetuated through legislation and policy. When it comes to environmental justice, those inequities intersect at almost every subject matter. Pennsylvania's number one industry is agriculture, an industry built on stolen land and stolen labor, an industry built upon racism that has created substantial wealth for some at the expense of others. And as agriculture grows and faces the challenges of feeding an increasing global population, its impact on our ecosystem will disproportionately hurt workers of color and communities of color, while we are simultaneously locked out of the economic benefits. Transportation policy is no different. The placement of highways and byways and trainways and all kinds of roadways through our communities, through communities of color and low-income communities, have isolated them, cutting these communities off from healthcare, good schools, and good jobs, all while subjecting them to the pollution left behind as people traverse through them every single day. We can do the same analysis for education, healthcare, job creation, housing, and crime prevention. We can look at legislation before the General Assembly today and see this as an opportunity to do things differently, to be critical of the environmental impacts of every piece. Do an environmental impact statement for every piece of legislation. How great would that be to understand how we can be intentional and not symbolic, calculated and coordinated in the steps towards an inclusive environmental policy, one in which Blacks, Latinx, and Native Americans and poor communities can get behind, because otherwise these policies look all too familiar. They are similar to those who have sidelined us or devalued our voices in the past. Last week, the governor's executive order and the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus's legislative package on environmental justice was a step in the right direction, but there is more work to do. My son is now in middle school, and his school has a reported asbestos problem. Classrooms are closed off from students and faculty. The school is an active construction site. Water fountains are inoperable. But even in my role as an elected official, I feel hopeless and helpless. Schools, parents, teachers, students, our calls for safe schools and healthy schools seems to fall on deaf ears as each day and each year another school is added to the list. And so I sit here every day and I send my son to school. And as I prepare these remarks, it hits me. that this is the second time in his life that he has been exposed to daily toxins, to an environmental hazard. And it is not an anomaly. It is the case for many children in the city of Philadelphia and across this Commonwealth. These children require us to work together towards achieving systemic, equitable, environmental justice, a safe and healthy Pennsylvania for all. That is the task. Thank you again for allowing me to share just a few words with you today.